مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. كانت هناك دائما ثلاثة تيارات ضمن الحركة الأميركية المحافظة: المحافظون الماليون الذين يؤمنون بالحكومة الصغيرة والإنفاق المحدود، والمحافظون من ناحية الدفاعية الذين يؤمنون بجيش قوي ومنافسة قوية نقف بها في وجه خصومنا، والمحافظون الدينيون الذين يؤمنون بأن الأخلاقيات الدينية والحرية الدينية ينبغي أن اختلاء مركز الصدارة في الحياة العامة للأمة. ربما لا يكون هناك دائما خط أحمر ساتا يفصل بين هذه الاتجاهات، ولكنها بكل تأكيد تيارات مختلفة ضمن الحركة المحافظة إجمالا. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنتحدث مع واحد من أشهر وأبرز زعماء التيار الديني ضمن الحركة الأميركية المحافظة، وهو المرشح الرئاسي السابق غاري باور. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. It's one of America's oldest principles, freedom to worship. And today we're talking about religious liberty and how it applies in American foreign policy. And I'm delighted to welcome Gary Bauer to our show. Thank you so much for being on our show.
Great to be here.
So when people talk about threats to religious liberty or religious freedom, what does that mean?
Well, it depends on where you are in the world, right? I mean, in a lot of countries, there are really life and death threats to people based on whatever their particular religious faith may be. Here in the United States, particularly in the last couple of decades, it tends to revolve around the question of whether believers of whatever faith can bring their faith-based principles to the workplace and a government position they hold. What right does a business person have, for example, to refuse to participate in a particular business transaction if it's with a group or an individual that may offend their sense of their own religious faith and what it requires? We've seen recently, I think shockingly here in the United States, some judicial nominees by the president being called out by senators because the senators were concerned that their Catholicism might inappropriately impact how they would approach various issues on the bench. So, and recently we've seen actually a fairly concerted number of attacks on Christian education, that somehow Christian schools are teaching what the critics say is hatred, but when you look at it, it's just traditional Christian teachings about the sanctity of life and the definition of marriage and those sorts of things.
So that's the agenda of religious liberty here in the United States.
Yes.
When you look internationally, how do you see the challenge there?
Well, again, depending on the country you're in, having a faith that is a small minority compared to the prevailing faith in a particular country can often mean not only something as harsh as imprisonment, it can sometimes mean that you're murdered or harmed because of that difference. In other cases, it's more subtle, the loss of job opportunities, being shunted aside to be outside the mainstream of the society. And then there are countries where you may be part of the majority faith, but the wrong sect in that majority faith. And so we'll see persecution in those cases. Right now, I'm one of the commissioners on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and we're seeing things like in China, not only are Christians being persecuted, but the Uyghurs, which is a group of Muslim Chinese, it appears are being put in what one could only call re-education camps, where the Chinese government apparently feels threatened by their citizens having loyalty to any competing entity other than the Chinese government. And we'll be coming out with a report, our annual report, soon, and it certainly will single out China as one of the countries that we have deep concern about in this regard.
What do you think the role of the U.S. government should be in advancing religious liberty abroad? How should that factor into our relations with governments that are friends of ours, like, say, the Saudis, or governments that are adversaries of ours, like, say, the Chinese?
Yes, it's a great question. Obviously, my bias is going to be that we ought to have the issue of religious liberty and human rights broadly as one of the factors that we take into consideration when we're working with other countries, our bilateral relationships with those countries and so forth. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, I think historically you can make a case that countries that deny human rights and more fundamentally deny the right of an individual to worship or seek God as they see fit end up being countries that are going to cause other foreign policy problems because of that lack of respect for human rights and religious liberty. On the other hand, history is replete with examples where we work with a country whose human rights policies and even their religious liberty policies are not things we're happy about. But because of realpolitik or because of issues that may be greater at the time, we swallow hard and still cooperate with that country. The most, probably the easiest non-controversial example to raise now is to reach back to a time when the Soviet Union and the United States were allies, even though we certainly had lots of arguments about human rights with Stalin's Russia, but nonetheless, in order to face the greater evil of Hitler's Germany, we worked together, and then once that evil had been defeated, we went into a long struggle with ourselves and the Soviet Union over the growth of communism.
So there is this natural tension, therefore,
there is.
Both with allies and adversaries.
No question about it. I would like to be an idealist about this. I'm not really a Henry Kissinger kind of guy. I don't think American foreign policy, I think American foreign policy is hard to sustain long term if the American people do not feel it has a moral dimension to it. And I think one of the things a lot of Americans will look at is, well, why are we working with this particular country when it's so oppressive it won't even allow its own people to worship freely? So it's something that we should take into consideration, but there are also countervailing priorities that also will weigh in that relationship.
The Trump administration has made a special effort on behalf of the dwindling Christian population in the Middle East.
Yes.
How high a priority do you think this should be? Do you think the administration is on the right path here?
I do. I think as a Christian, it's tragic for me as a Christian to look at the Middle East and see that in the birthplace of Christianity, literally ancient Christian communities are disappearing. And some will argue, well, let's just provide a haven. But these are Christians that have lived in this area of the world for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I do think it's good and appropriate for the United States to speak out in defense of those communities, as well as speaking out in defense of minority Muslim communities in countries where a different brand of Islam might be in a majority. I have to say my heart particularly breaks seeing the lot of the Kurdish people in the Middle East who find themselves in the unfortunate position of being at a crossroads where very major world powers are jockeying for position, and all too often the history of the Kurds has been that they get run over by one of those powers or another. And when I look at the region and look at the area where Kurds predominate, you actually see a much more effective effort at pluralism than we see in other areas of the Middle East. And so in some way, the Kurds, who appear to be orphans when you look at how world powers are treating them, may be presenting us with exactly the example we need to look at if we yearn to see religious pluralism throughout the Middle East.
When we first started this conversation, you opened with a fascinating discussion of religious liberty challenges here in the United States.
Yes.
When you talk to other governments about their religious liberty challenges, do they often throw these American problems back at you and say, well, clean up your own act before you come and talk to us about what we're doing wrong?
Great. It's a good question. You probably have noticed this. It seems, my experience has been that the worse the country is in oppressing its people, the more likely they are to point out our relative small flaws in dealing with religious liberty issues here. So you find Iran lecturing us in the wake of the terrible events in Ferguson, Missouri. Or you'll see the Chinese, who, as I mentioned earlier, I believe it's not an overstatement to say they literally have declared war on religion, it seems, in the last couple of years, raising really foibles that one might point to here in comparison to what we've seen happen in China in recent decades.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to discuss religious conservatism here in the United States and its connection to the American political system in just a moment. My guest today is Gary Baur. Gary is one of the most influential and recognizable religious conservatives in American politics, a presidential candidate in the year 2000 and former Undersecretary of Education and Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to President Ronald Reagan. He is currently president of American Values, an educational nonprofit organization. A fierce advocate of religious liberty around the world, he was appointed last year by President Trump to serve on the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. So let's move a bit between politics and policy. You're a strong Christian conservative. Whatever one can say about the president, it's tough to argue that he is in the mode and model of a traditional Christian conservative. Yet I gather you're a strong supporter.
Yes.
Why?
Well, the question is not a new one, as you can imagine, and many Christian leaders have been asked it. I think one has to go back to the previous 8 years before the last presidential election, where there was a widespread belief throughout particularly the conservative Christian community, that the Obama administration was really at war with certain Christian ideas and Christian liberties. For example, the entire weight of the federal government and the power of the federal government was brought down on the heads of the Little Sisters of the Poor, who, if you're not familiar with the organization, is actually made up of little Catholic nuns who spend their time trying to help the poor. And the issue was a disagreement between that group and the Obama Justice Department over to what extent they had to participate in Obamacare, including in abortion coverage and so forth. There were also a number of Supreme Court decisions that had been made, which in the Christian community, particularly among Christian conservatives, there was a growing fear that religious liberty, which has been so central to the United States, was beginning to get chipped away at. And people looked at the makeup of the court and began to ask themselves, between the two presidential candidates of the two major parties, which candidate would be most likely to appoint the kind of Supreme Court justices that would make me feel better that the traditional and basic right to religious liberty we've enjoyed in this country would continue to be observed and promoted. And I think then candidate Trump was very astute in understanding how important this was to conservative Christian voters. So he not only said he would appoint justices in the mold of Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito, but he famously ended up putting out a list of candidates that would be among those that he would choose. And then he did something that I think perhaps only conservative Christians might have really zeroed in on. He publicly said a number of times, no more stealth candidates. In other words, no more nominees to the court who have no record on any of these issues. That had been the the approach that a number of previous Republican presidents particularly had favored.
You ran for president.
I did.
It is not. It's not every day that someone so associated with the idea of faith in public life runs for president. What was the experience like as a Christian conservative running for president?
Yes, it was an extraordinary experience on a lot of different levels. My father was a janitor. Nobody in my family had ever finished high school, let alone gone on to graduate from college and then law school. And so my dad's nickname was Spike. He was also a part-time truck driver. So I remember the first presidential debate I was in the Republican primaries, where I was standing up on the stage looking down the stage at a millionaire, Steve Forbes, a guy like George Bush, who had had many years of experience in politics, John McCain, a war hero, and here's Spike Bauer's son in this debate. So that was one experience. But the other thing was that as somebody that took my faith seriously, as well as taking politics seriously, I wasn't adverse to bringing some of those faith-based ideas into the debates, and also being willing to speak directly about how my faith as a Christian would impact the way that I would govern.
When you look at religion in public life in America in general, too much, too little, or just about right?
I think it's been just about right, but I am one of those that feel very strongly that there is an effort in the United States, as we follow sort of the same path Europe has, a trend towards secularism, of trying to marginalize faith-based candidates, or to somehow suggest that if a candidate was motivated by his or her faith to take a particular position on a public policy issue, that somehow that would be inappropriate. I remember in one of my first visits to a high school, I spoke to a group of high school seniors, and one of the first questions I got was, Mr. Bauer, do you think it's appropriate for you to be running? I saw in your material that you're a conservative Christian, and you say you're going to be influenced by your conservative Christian beliefs as you approach issues like racial reconciliation and poverty. Haven't you heard of the separation of church and state? And I thought that was a strange question to get from a student at an American public high school in a country whose founding idea, I believe, is in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed, not by their government, but by their Creator, with certain inalienable rights, among these the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the rest of the campaign, when I visited high schools, I started asking students whether they were aware of what the central idea of America was, and more specifically, did they know those very important sentences right in the middle of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And I even gave a challenge that I would give $20 to a student who could tell me the end of the sentence that begins, we hold these truths. And in about 50 school visits, I only lost $40. I would have much rather had to get a second job, because I think it's hard to be an American kid in the true sense of that word if you don't know those words in the middle of that paragraph.
So most people tend to know life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but not about endowed by their Creator. Is that
They not only don't know endowed by their Creator, there are a few folks in the American political scene that do know those words and intentionally have left them out when giving the sentence.
Gary Bauer, thank you so much for joining us.
My
on
pleasure.
Dakhel, Washington.
My pleasure to be with you.
America is there, and you know, we're trying to find a solution to the Palestinian-Israel issue. But the Gulf states, Israel, folks are kind of looking at mutual security issues, and I think that's a positive. It puts less of a burden on the U.S. to kind of, deal with everything. It's folks saying, hey, okay, we'll deal with the Houthis in Yemen. We'll deal with the Iranian threat. We'll work together more closely, and in some instances, maybe even have some conversation with the Israelis. So I think that's all positive. Again, issues have to be taken care of. The Palestinian problem has to be solved. But I just think we're in a better place now that folks are at least engaged in a conversation and an understanding of where the real threat is. And the real threat really is from Iran. The real threat really is from that regime, which is the largest state sponsor of terrorism. And so I think that kind of understanding bodes well for U.S. security interests, and certainly that's my principal concern.
As loyal viewers of this show know, I hail from Rhode Island, the smallest state in the Union and one of the 13 original colonies. But despite our size, we were first in something very important: religious liberty. We were founded by a Puritan pastor named Roger Williams, who left England and then escaped Massachusetts in search of a place where all people could worship as they saw fit, free from government control or coercion. Williams believed fiercely and powerfully in his faith, but he also gave birth to the idea of the separation of church and state, a principle by which government should be focused solely on the secular interests of the citizens, separate from religion, which focused on their beliefs, their ethics, and their souls. Under Williams, the new colony of Rhode Island only punished people if they violated the second 5 of the 10 commandments, the rules governing man's behavior toward fellow man, not the first 5 of the commandments, the rules governing man's behavior toward God. It was a revolutionary step, a step forward in the idea of civil government. I believe in religious liberty. People in America can and should have the right to worship as they wish, as Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, Baha'i, or any other religion. And they should have the right not to worship at all. And I believe government should facilitate the exercise of these rights, as long as it doesn't amount to endorsing any one religion or faith over any other religion or faith. And while I respect the role of faith and religion in other countries around the world, I believe America should stand up for the right of people everywhere to choose how they worship and even whether they worship. That right to choose is a core American ideal. Not everyone here in America or around the world agrees with this approach. They believe they have a monopoly on the path to God, a monopoly on the path to heaven. You can find these views somewhere in almost all religions. Indeed, there's nothing wrong with an individual believing his or her religion provides the correct answers to the great questions of humankind. The key question is whether those views are allowed to control public life, whether politics is animated by the freedom to choose one's faith or the forced order of religious fiat. With a cacophony of voices all over the political map on this, as on so many other issues, we may not have the perfect answer in America. But I do think Roger Williams was a pretty good model, a true believer, a man of God, who understood that his faith was not lessened by allowing others to choose how they practiced their faith. When people choose a different path, he didn't call it heresy. He called it freedom. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الحرية الدينية في بلدكم، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.